Okay guys, so in this tutorial I'm just going to go over a Spring project that I'm working on. This is just going to give you an overview of how Spring MVC works. So the web application that I'm working on is called, we're just calling it Travel Junkie. So in a Spring project, um, so most likely you're going to want to use what's called, I'll start kind of from the beginning, but you're going to want to use what's called Maven. So in a project, you're going to have lots of it's called dependencies. So Maven is a build tool, and you'd have to download that or get that plugin um, in Eclipse. But basically, when you have Maven, so these are all the jar files or the libraries that we're using in our project. So when you're coding with a team and you're using Git and GitHub, and you have to have all these dependencies and jars, each of your team members would, without Maven, would kind of have to go download these separately, and every time you build the application and share it and pull it down to a new user, it's going to be a pain. You're going to have to go through and you're going to have to download all these jars and dependencies, and that's just a lot of work and a big headache. So Maven came along, and Maven is like I said, it's a build tool. And basically what it does is it keeps track of all the jar files, Java archive files that you need, which is going to be kind of, as you see here, most of these are Spring. So if you want to use the Spring framework, you have to download all these jar files. And there's a lot of other stuff in here. Hibernate's in here, and there's basically Servlet API jars and kind of JUnit for testing. There's MySQL connector. A lot of these jars you'll need for a Spring project, or you will need, and you don't want to have to go download these manually. So basically that's where, like I said, Maven comes in. It's a build tool. So whenever you use Maven and you're creating a Spring project, Maven will have a file. It's called pom.xml. So we'll take a look at this file. So basically I started this project, and my team members, they can pull this down from GitHub, and when they get this pom.xml and they build the program, it'll go in here and it'll check for every dependency. So here's our Spring Framework dependencies. So basically it's going in here and it's going to download and make sure that you have all these dependencies downloaded for you to use in your project. So you can see most of these are a lot of Spring. This is Hibernate. You got some Glassfish server dependencies. This is kind of like our MySQL database dependencies. So this is really nice because, like I said, this takes care of all the jar files that you need. You just have to know the versions. You type them in here, and then basically Maven goes out and downloads them from the internet and makes sure that ensures that you have them so you can build your project and run it correctly. Okay, so that is Maven, which uses that pom.xml file for the dependencies. And what we'll go over is kind of how the structure looks in your files here. So you'll have your source main Java. So with Spring, I'm not going to go over this too much. I'm just going to highlight an overview real quick. But what's very important is you're going to have your configuration file, app config. So this kind of tells Spring kind of what to look for. Um, so if we go in here, component scan, so I'm not going to go over everything, but I'm going to highlight some stuff. So component scan basically says, hey, scan com.traveljunkie, basically scan all these packages, and you should be able to find the things that you will need. Okay, and then I'm going to go over a couple things, just highlight it. Auto-wired basically means that, so here we're declaring a variable. an environment variable. So basically, we haven't created that variable or instantiated it. That's what AutoWire does. It creates the variables on, or creates the objects on the fly, and basically manages them for you. So it'll know when you need to create this object. Basically, it knows, hey, this is dependent on this object, and we need to create an object, an instance of this class environment, and we need to manage it. So that's what kind of an overview of what the Spring framework does. Spring framework is basically all about dependency injection. So basically what that means is kind of like here, basically creating an object, basically managing those objects. They'll be called beans, and that prevents a lot of your classes and your objects from being dependent on each other. And you can see here, there's lots of annotations in Spring. I'm not going to go over all these. This is letting Spring know, hey, this is our configuration file. Here, what this line here is doing is basically view resolver tells Spring that basically when it gets a view, it kind of resolves it by basically, let me actually show you because that's going to get confusing. Let me go to the controller real quick. So right here, I'm going to explain this later, but this view account. So I'm actually returning a file called viewaccount.jsp. But Spring knows when I return this that I'm looking for a JSP file. I don't have to specifically put .jsp. So that's not too important, but I'm just telling you kind of what goes on in the app config file. Just lots of good configurations. Now, data source is kind of another configuration, basically letting Spring know where our database is, kind of our username and password to connect to that database, kind of all of our Java database connection settings, letting it all know all that. And then basically session factory, that's kind of like if a user logs in, it's kind of a session. So Spring will manage all that stuff for us. This is kind of for mail, but yeah, you can kind of get the point that there's lots of basically configurations that you would set up in this file. And basically how Spring works is basically what you have is, I'm going to pull up Paint real quick. Hopefully this doesn't get too awful. But in Spring, this might get a little sloppy. But basically you have a, let's see here. So dispatcher servlet, and then if I knew how to use Paint, that would be great. Controllers, and then we'll do views. Okay, so I'm just going to overview this real quick. Not dive into this too much, but Spring MVC. So model view controller, that's what that stands for. So basically you'll have just kind of a sloppy kind of diagram here. But whenever you have in your URL, so your URL, you type in, like let's say traveljunkie.com, every request, basically when you're typing in a URL that's a GET request, it's going to go to like your Apache Tomcat server, and you're going to have, or it's going to go to, in our case, I'll show you, it goes to port 8080, and you're going to have a software that's listening to that port, and it's going to handle all the requests. But when you get to the coding part and the Spring part of things, basically every request gets sent to the dispatcher servlet. So the dispatcher servlet basically decides which controller to send it to. And it basically examines the URL. So at all the controllers, and I'm going to show you the controllers here in the code. All the controllers, we have all the controllers. We just have 2 right now. So the dispatcher servlet basically, let's go to it real quick. Actually, I'm not going to go to it and explain that. But let's just say the dispatcher servlet is basically a servlet, which means it takes in URL requests. It's basically examining the URL and trying to figure out what that URL wants. So basically, any URLs that end in just the slash, which basically means the home page. So you're going to have at controller, and Spring knows, the dispatcher servlet basically knows that this is a controller and it handles your home page requests. So that's what it's looking for. And this auto wired up here, like I said, we're declaring a variable, and Spring creates this variable for us, or Spring creates this object for us. That's what AutoWire does. It creates this object when we need it, and it kind of gets rid of it when we don't, and kind of manages that object. But we don't need to go into that too much. But request mapping, this is the controller. It's called the home controller. That's what we called it. This is the controller that takes care of any home page request. And this one's pretty simple. Returns a string. Basically, we just called it show home page. That's all it's doing. And we're passing in a model. Basically, what a model is I kind of like to think of it like a temporary object to hold data. Basically, the model is going to be passed from your business logic to, so let me show you here. So dispatcher servlet kind of goes to your controllers. Your controllers, in our case, consist of the home controller and the account controller. And these are kind of like servlets, basically, is what they are, because they handle requests as well. But this is like the main controller. And then once it gets a request, it decides kind of which controller to pass it to. So the home controller basically handles all the home page requests. Okay, and then basically a model, how do I want to put this? A model is kind of like a model. It's kind of like an object. Like you would use Java to create an object that holds data. That way, when it goes to the controller, I'll show you here. Oops. Go back to my eclipse. So we basically want to get a model ready. And I'm not going to explain this too much, but basically, let's see here. This code's commented out, but basically, I would use that model and I would add basically information to it. This is basically creating a budget object, which you don't have to know what any of that means, but basically creating an object and putting it inside the model. Model is kind of like a place to hold data. So let's say if I collect like the username and a bunch of information from the user, and then I can pass that to this model object. And actually this will make more sense when I go over to the account controller. But anyways, in this method here, in this controller, it's handling the home page request, and basically you don't really need to look at that right now because that might get a little confusing, but we want to return the index.jsp, which is the home page. So remember, I don't have to put .jsp because the view view resolver in the config file takes care of that. And then I'll show you where the JSP files are. JSP files, you can see all of these are our web pages that we have at the moment. Index.jsp is the home page. So basically I'm telling this controller, hey, if you get a request that doesn't have anything at the end, then we just want to return the home page. So we'll return index.jsp. If we open up index.jsp, this is just kind of mostly HTML. A JSP is special because we can actually code logic. You can have obviously HTML in here. JSP is kind of special in what type of code you can have in here. But you can see this is all of our home page. So it returns this home page. Okay, and then I'm going to go over the account controller. So back to, so using the annotations at controller, and then basically this is saying, hey, this controller is going to handle any request, URL request that end in account. So if I go back to, if I go to Travel Junkie and I type in account, that's when I type an account, that request is going to get sent to the account controller. It's going to come here, and it's gonna, our auto wired is going to create all the objects we need, and then it's going to come down here, and this is for GET request. So we're not posting any data or anything, we just want to get the account page. So this is the controller that handles the request mapping for the account URL, anything that has the account at the end of the URL, and then it's going to come down here and say, hey, for a GET request, we want to call this method, you can call it whatever you want, we want to have a model. Let's create a model, which is just where we can hold our data in. In this case, we're going to, you don't have to understand this too much, but we're basically going to get the email of current user. So we're going to use this here to get context and basically get the email of the current user, if there is one. And we're going to store that in an email or email string. And then this here basically retrieve user object. So we're going to use that email that we got to call a method called find by email, which uses the user service to go into the database and find that user object, and then it's going to save it as the user. This user object in the database contains a lot of good stuff that we want to display on the web page and stuff like that. So basically, after we retrieve that object from the database, we want to pass that info or pass that object to the model. Remember, the model is what holds kind of our information that we want to use. So that model is going to be ready to use, and it's going to, the data from the user is going to be in that model. And then let's just return the view account.jsp, view account.jsp. I'm not going to look for it, but let's go back to our paint. So basically, Spring MVC model view controller dispatcher servlet takes every single incoming request and decides where to send it, what controller to send it to. And then once it finds a controller to send it to, that controller basically processes logic, grabs data and puts it in a model. Once we have that data in a model, because we did some processing, like this account controller would basically do some processing. Let's just ignore that. This account controller would do some processing to get some stuff from the database, maybe some user info, and then it would bring it back and put it in our model, and then the model gets passed to the servlet along with whatever JSP we need to return. So basically the controller finds the JSP page that we need to return, it finds the model, sends it back to the dispatcher servlet. The dispatcher servlet sees that we have some data in our model and finds the JSP that we need in our views. And if we go to, let's say, let's go to update account page. So this might look a little overwhelming, but if we go in here and trying to see if we can find where some stuff is being used from the model. Let's go to index actually. Yeah, so basically if we're returning like a JSP page like this and we have a model with data in it, we can actually access that data and display it on the JSP page. And then I'm just going to go over these real quick. So entities, that's kind of like, click on that real quick. So entities, this is where we use Hibernate. It's an ORM framework, object relational mapping, but basically a framework that allows us to map our objects to a database. So basically in this example, using these annotations, it's mapping to a table in the database called user. So in our case, we're using MySQL, but basically we can map basically objects in the database. So this object would be a user object, and so if this allows us to basically create an object, and then we don't have to write any SQL query. Basically, Hibernate takes care of all that heavy lifting for us, takes care of the JDBC and all that stuff. We don't have to write any queries. We just have to tell Hibernate what we want to map to the database. It's really nice. And then here's models. So like I said, this would be our Java used to create like stuff that we want to store in models. And then we have some validation and stuff. But I'm not going to go into that too much. So that's probably going to be it for this video. I just wanted to give a high-level overview basically on how Spring works. I think it's important to know the get post request and kind of what's going on. We're using Apache Tomcat server, so that server software is listening for a port 8080. So basically it's listening for this port. So basically when we send it a request, like in this example, we're going to send a request to port 8080. We're going to send it travel junkie homepage. So it sends that to port 8080. Apache Tomcat is listening for any incoming requests. It takes those requests and sends it to the dispatcher servlet, and then the dispatcher servlet finds out which controller it needs to send it to. The controller basically does all the logic, the Java logic, and then creates a model, and then it also returns a JSP page to display to the user, and then yeah, basically sends that stuff back to the browser. Okay, that is it